Security Plus Assessments and Audits, Part 1. Let's look into the crystal ball into the future, your future. A few months from now, let's say. You're hired, hypothetically, as a computer consultant to come into a small, medium-sized business and work up a security profile on this company as they get ready to put into place their security policy. So you ask them, the first question out of your mouth is, do you want to secure your data, your systems, your facility? You want to secure your applications and the privacy of your customers and your employees? Their answer will be, of course, without hesitation, yes. If your next question is, how much do you want to spend? Then my job as your instructor will have been a total failure. Because the answer to that question, how much do you want to spend, is not the responsibility of your client or your customer. It's your responsibility. It's your responsibility to help that customer assess the risk, to assess the vulnerabilities. And then based on that information, based on the value of their assets, only then can you start to begin to answer that question, how much do you want to spend? In Assessments and Audits Part 1, we're going to look at 5 key knowledge areas. First of all, we'll look at risk assessment, as well as vulnerability assessment. Of course, we'll look at some tools that are used to conduct those vulnerability assessments as well. We'll also talk about mitigation, also known as controls and countermeasures. We'll do an overview of penetration testing, and we'll compare it to simply scanning or surveying the environment. And then finally, we'll look at a slew, as we say in Texas, of monitoring and analysis tools. Recently, I got a homeowner's policy, and when you get the policy, they give you this big kind of pamphlet or brochure to go through. And one of the things they recommend highly, the insurance company, is that you go through your home with a video camera and you document all of the belongings that you have. Then you place a monetary value on those belongings. Then you want to step back and you want to say, well, how vulnerable is my home to those valued possessions being stolen or caught fire or flooded or on and on and on. That same kind of concept that we might do for an insurance company and an insurance policy on our home is the same type of thing we're going to do for our organization. Before you can put in place a security plan, you have to basically say, what do I have? How is it vulnerable? What is it worth if I lose it? And what am I willing to do to protect that asset? So we're going to begin this domain of the Security Plus series talking about the very important aspect, risk assessment. Now, first up on our plate is risk assessment. Let me just tell you, I'm going to define risk assessment first in this nugget, not because this particular process comes first in your strategy and implementation. As a matter of fact, threat analysis or vulnerabilities in threat analysis will probably come first. But the problem is, we've already covered in this Nugget series already so much about different types of threats and vulnerabilities. I want to get to defining risk assessment first of all. It's a key component of your security strategy, and it includes the process not only of evaluating the levels of risk in your organization. Of course, that's going to be based on qualitative and quantitative analysis. In other words, subjective, an element of guessing and best known knowledge, and objective, or actually placing a dollar value on different assets, logical and physical. It also includes, during this process, anticipating risk. So even though there's not an inherent dangerous situation that your company faces now, you want to creatively anticipate the possibility of that risk and add that to the assessment as well. For example, let's go back to 9/11. There were a few individuals that were able to identify the risk of someone flying a plane into the World Trade Center. However, that level of risk was deemed acceptable based on the probabilities, as far as some were concerned, that it could actually occur. And this risk assessment process will govern the steps we take in an iterative process of addressing vulnerabilities and threats and analyzing those vulnerabilities and threats in our organization. So, as I mentioned at the beginning when I talked about, getting the home owner's insurance policy, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to make an asset identification. You're going to identify and classify all of the assets in your organization. This includes logical assets like intellectual property and formulas and your name brand, the goodwill of your company, things like that. Not just physical assets like servers and workstations and people and facilities. So identify and classify all of your assets. Then you need to place some type of value on those assets, either quantitatively, like a dollar value, or qualitatively, which assets are worth more than others. For example, people would be worth more than desks. Okay? So you're going to you use some type of system, a numbering system or labeling system, to place valuation on all those assets. That has to be the first thing. And that goes back to my introductory discussion when I said when you walk in, you're not going to ask your customer or your client or the person you're consulting for, how much do you want to spend? This decision won't be made until after this entire process is done. You don't want to walk in there going, well, I'm going to have to go buy a bunch of Cisco firewalls and ASA appliances and intrusion detection systems and remote access servers and VPN tunneling. No, we're going to go through this process first. Let's take a little sidebar here and talk about qualifying risk and quantifying risk. Now, first of all, qualifying risk is more subjective. In other words, you'll have a scale. Maybe, 5 is the highest risk, 2 is the lowest risk, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You'll have labels for these, high, medium, low, none. So, in other words, you're going to identify, classify, and then you're going to use some type of subjective qualifying method for assigning value or assigning risk to different areas. This happens more with things like logical assets, okay? Things like goodwill, formulas, intellectual property, okay? But quantifying risk is a whole different thing. Now, these formulas are the ones that you're expected to know as far as quantification of risk goes. First of all, you have what's called single loss expectancy, or SLE. SLE is the asset value multiplied times the EF, or the exposure factor. This is the damage to an asset per specific incident. In other words, it's the exact cost, most likely, of recovering from an incident. If someone steals backup tapes or breaks in and steals your web server, okay, if data is stolen or extracted, all of the direct and indirect costs of a possible incident need to be included. Exposure factor is a percentage that basically indicates how much damage an incident can cause on a specific asset. Now, obviously, the same incident could cause damage to more than one asset. If that's the case, you have to calculate EF for each asset. So the SLE, single loss expectancy, for an incident with a particular asset is asset value factored with the exposure factor. The annual loss expectancy is how often an incident occurs per year. This is pretty difficult, okay, but it should be based on information gathering, statistics, historical data from both internal and external sources, like case studies, for example, or information from insurance companies. So you multiply the SLE that you've obviously calculated up here first, you multiply the SLE times the annualized rate of occurrence, or the ARO, or how many times you think that this is going to happen in a 12-month period. This will give you an indication of the money, the annualized loss expectancy, that you would be spending every year to protect that asset. Then you'll go into an iterative process that will go around and around and around again, assessing risk, looking at known and potential threats, And what are the existing vulnerabilities? Remember, a vulnerability is something that your company or your customer is presently subject to based on their existing state. And I'll talk a little bit more later about how we do some penetration testing and some gap analysis to determine that level of vulnerability. But a threat is something that can or will or must eventually come against your systems or your services or your facility. Then, based on all this information gathering and this reporting and surveying and brainstorming and white papering and surveying, you will then implement your controls and countermeasures. Now, what are controls? Well, we just spent several nuggets talking about access controls. Those are some controls, okay? Authentication systems, for example, physical security, Kerberos, virtual private networks, and the like, and countermeasures, intrusion detection, intrusion prevention, firewalls, honeypots. Now, just because the decisions are made here, we're not going to implement those yet. We're going to go through a process of evaluating the effectiveness, doing some pilot testing and some staging, and auditing the success of those countermeasures and those controls on our existing security posture. Then we'll put together an action plan. This is where we're going to go out and start deciding, okay, we're going to go buy the Cisco PIX firewall or the adaptive security appliance or the modular intrusion prevention sensor to pop into our multi-layer switches, okay? And this is, again, an iterative process. We'll go back to the drawing board here. But notice this little parentheses here. And this is a parentheses. This is residual risk. What this means is, for example, go back to our 9/11 scenario, is this is the risk you're willing to accept. Okay? For whatever reason, there's a level of risk, there's a level of threat, and existing vulnerability that your company has decided is residual and ongoing, and we're willing to either accept it or we're going to go pay an insurance company to cover us if it happens. Okay? Or we're just going to accept the risk, and if it happens, we'll outlay the funds and the people and the time to respond to the incident and fall back on disaster recovery and so on and so forth. So there's always going to be a level of residual risk because this is never going to be a 100% solution. Now, I don't want you going into a steering committee meeting or a security team meeting with just a blank piece of paper or a blank notepad and just say, you know what, let's just start brainstorming. Let me give you some specific ways to characterize risk or how we can relate our present activity to present risk. For example, here's some ways to think of things. Think about the origin, okay? Is the risk an internal structured attack, or is it an internal unstructured attack or an accident or just poor planning or poor security practices or lack of enforcement of existing security policies? Or is it an external structured attack, a malicious user or a hacker attacking our system? Or is it just some bot that's working against our perimeter routers automatically? Think about the origin in the form of individuals. Think about hostile employees, employees that weren't properly trained, consultants, temporary employees, okay, competitors. What's your relationship to the government? Is your risk being defined by HIPAA or Sarbanes-Oxley? Okay, then think about risk. Is it a particular activity, okay, or a particular incident? For example, somebody stealing confidential data, a person penetrating our perimeter security or physical security, power failures. Okay, think of specific activities, denial of service attacks, for example. Then think of all of the known consequences that you can think of. Okay, results, impacts, unavailability of services, unavailability of your e-commerce servers. Okay, the consequence of losing market share, the consequence of having the legal authorities coming into your organization. Okay, the reduction of goodwill. Specific causes, okay? Floods, human error, design error, hurricanes, human intervention, failure to plan. All of these things are part of the thought process. Do you have risk because of lack of protective mechanisms? You have no firewall. You have no security suites on your workstations and laptops that have spyware and adware and virus and worm protection and privacy controls to guard against email phishing. And then finally, time and place. Are you in the wrong place at the wrong time? Are you susceptible to environmental disasters? So these are good categories to help you when you sit down initially, once you've done the identification and the asset inventory and the valuation, and you're starting to define what are the present threats against your organization, what are your vulnerabilities, and how do we define present and future risks. Now the next thing we want to talk about is how is your organization or your customer going to deal with risk. I mentioned there's always going to be some residual risks, some acceptable risk. But what are our main approaches? Now there are 4 main risk management strategies, and this is very general, but that's okay. The Security Plus exam is not, let's say, the CISSP or the CISA or CISM that are, deeply policy and procedure and strategy and process oriented. We want you to understand that there's really, from a strategic point of view, 4 ways to address risk. The first way is to simply say, you know what, we're going to accept the risk. We have valued our assets and we have deemed that this particular risk, let's say someone setting off a bomb in our facility, is such a remote occurrence that to spend the money to prevent any incident of this happening, we're just going to accept the risk. In certain areas, to use poker terms, we're just simply going to go all in, all right? Or you can mitigate the risk. Mitigate simply means spending the money, the resources and time, in people, in training, in software and hardware to put into place controls, and you're pretty familiar with those, controls and countermeasures. Controls, access controls, authentication controls, authorization controls, accounting controls, physical security, password policies, audit policies, countermeasures. What is this? Intrusion detection systems, intrusion prevention systems, virtual private networking, an IPsec internal and external solution for confidentiality, integrity, and availability, firewalls, access control lists. Okay, these are countermeasures. Honeypots, all right, there's my honeypot. Those are countermeasures. You're familiar with those. We can transfer the risk. How do we transfer the risk? Well, we can say this. If we have an incident, we'll just simply charge more to our customer for our product, and we will pass that along to the customer. Okay? If that isn't acceptable in your business plan, then maybe you can insure it. Insurance is an example of transferring the risk. Or you can basically cease and desist. In other words, whatever it is that you are doing that is vulnerable to threats, cease that particular activity and stop the risk. If you deem that having, let's say, at some point, a retail organization decides to start selling products over the internet, all right, and they have a e-commerce web portal, and at some point after malicious users cracking those websites, after credit card information being stolen, overwhelming denial of service attacks and worms, your organization may just decide as a retailer, this is just too much. We're going to abandon selling products over the web and go back to brick and mortar and direct sales like we did before. You think it hasn't happened? Trust me, it has happened. So those are your 4 ways to kind of strategize the management of risk. You accept the risk and its consequences, you mitigate with controls and countermeasures, you transfer the risk, or you cease the activity that exposes the risk. Next, we're going to look at vulnerability assessment as part of that kind of circular iterative process that I showed you earlier. And let me just tell you this. You cannot do proper vulnerability assessment unless you have a good perpetual knowledge of the threats to your assets. Now, the reason why I'm not going to go into a big, long, detailed discussion of threat assessment is we've spent a large portion of the first half of this Security Plus Nugget series talking about threat assessment, all the different types of threats, and we've talked about controls and countermeasures, and we've still got more to talk about, but we talk about threats throughout this nugget. Vulnerability assessment, however, is only done after you have an excellent working knowledge and an excellent prepared team of people to go in and find out what the vulnerabilities are in your organization. And again, you have to have a knowledge of threats to be able to do that. Now, I want to hit one really important point here as we talk about vulnerability assessment. There is a difference, a key difference between vulnerability assessment or vulnerability analysis and penetration testing. And as I show you some of these tools now and later on in this nugget, there's going to be some overlap here. And what I mean is this. You may simply say, we're going to do a vulnerability assessment, and I want you to come in and we're going to scan and do inventory of the vulnerabilities with tools like scanners and analyzers. We'll also go through the process of doing surveys and interviewing key people in key departments, getting input from business leaders and team leaders on known vulnerabilities and security holes. Information gathering. See, scanning is different than penetration testing, because you can see here on this list, I've even got password crackers listed here, okay? Password crackers, this is actually a very intrusive method. You're actually using known tools to run against passwords and to run against hashes to see if people are using weak passwords, to see if they're violating password policies. So there's a fine line between vulnerability assessment and scanning and doing true penetration testing, where you bring in most likely third-party individuals to literally hack into your systems and trying to find the security holes. Okay, so keep that in mind as we go through this. There's different levels of assessment. There's kind of an evaluation, or there's penetration. Okay, the first vulnerability assessment tool we're going to look at is a scanner, a port scanner or a port mapper. And the most common one, the most popular one is Nmap, N-M-A-P. And this is a sample doing an nmap-a of a scanme.nmap.org domain. You can see it's showing interesting ports that are actually being used and opened. So this is going to be used on an organization to say, what protocols and services are we using right now in this particular organization? So you can see if services like FTP, SMTP, HTTP, POP3, NetBIOS, other ports, Gopher, Secure Shell, you can get an idea of what protocols and services are running on that organization. Now the thing here is twofold. For a malicious user, I want to know what ports are being used so I can exploit vulnerabilities against those protocols and services, especially the ones that are insecure, or transfer the communication in clear text. The other thing is for an organization to find out, are we running protocols and services on ports that we shouldn't be? This is part of kind of locking down and securing your environment. Only use the ports for the services and protocols that you need. So one of the first things we're going to use is that port scanner or port mapper. Here's the website for Nmap, nmap.org. It's also insecure.org. This would be a great thing to add to your favorites in your browser, and spend some time up here because it has quite a bit of tools that you can use for vulnerability testing, vulnerability assessment. For example, you can see here we've got pass crackers, password crackers. These are tools that you would want to use to crack passwords. There's a bunch of them out there that are very popular. Here's three, or let me just mention two right now. Cain and Abel is a very powerful tool for Windows that can do password cracking, brute force attacks. In other words, just trying many attacks over and over and over again. Dictionary attacks, they're going to use words that are found in the dictionary, so people are using passwords that are actual English words. You can crack those. Cryptanalysis attacks. You can use Cain and Abel to record voice over IP conversations. So this is just a very powerful tool. It's one used for Windows. John the Ripper is also popular. This is a multi-platform password hash cracker. And again, lots of hashes are used that are not secure. Windows NT 2000 XP LAN manager hashes, those are insecure. Old hashing mechanisms like on routers. I think some Cisco routers use the Visionaire encryption protocol, which is very weak and can be cracked as well. So these are tools that are used against you within your organization and from without. There are also tools that you're going to want to do for some basic vulnerability assessment. These may also be used in a full-blown penetration testing on your network as well. If I go back to insecure.org, I can see packet sniffers. And packet sniffers are basically tools that we've looked at already. I showed you my favorite, which is Wireshark. It used to be known as Ethereal, and it's basically a packet sniffer. And then I actually brought this up and showed it to you, and we looked at an instant message earlier in this Nugget series. So I'm not going to revisit that and waste your time. But this is going to basically sniff out local area networks. A very powerful wireless sniffer that you should know about this one is Kismet. This is very powerful, typically used in Linux environments. You can see the little Linux over here, but it also works in Windows. This tool is used for war driving. We talked about that in the wireless security nugget. Also war walking, and you know what? War skating. Why not? If there's any type of transportation you can do, and if you can use a wireless packet sniffer while you do it, well, then you can add that to the list. For example, if you like to ride a jet ski, I suppose there's war jet skiing that you can do and just cruise down the river and wireless sniff all those homes and businesses that are right there on the river or the side of a lake. So those are tools as well. I might just stay here. This is a really good tool to use. You can see vulnerability scanners. Vulnerability scanners are used to basically, we saw Nmap earlier, but there's other scanners as well. There's the Nessus Unix vulnerability assessment tool, and this is a very powerful tool. You can also scan ranges of IP addresses. There's lots of IP address scanners out there, and these can be used to do reconnaissance on your network to find out any unused blocks of IP addresses that can be spoofed on your internal network, or to learn more about your network topology to run attacks from zombies that are being used in distributed denial of service attacks. So there's a wide variety of tools. I would highly recommend, remember, the Security Plus exam is not vendor specific. So you're not going to be asked any questions specifically about a tool like Nmap, for example, or Nessus. But I would spend some time up here at insecure.org, a fantastic site to learn about vulnerability assessment tools and methodologies. Now, protocol analyzers is a special category that goes all the way from basically data link layer 2 all the way up to the application layers. And protocol analyzers can be software that you install on an operating system, for example, like Wireshark, which used to be Ethereal, or Kismet for wireless, or AeroPeak for wireless. But as you can see here, down through the years, we've also had physical devices that do protocol analysis for us, generating all the information not into a graphical user interface, but basically in a console-based format. And so these particular devices run in a promiscuous mode, and they pull all the information off of the wire. They'll plug into a switch or a multi-layer switch and pull all the traffic off the wire and do protocol analysis. So you can see different vendors like Hewlett-Packard, for example, for years have been designing these physical standalone protocol analysis tools. Now, some of the newer ones that you see are more handheld devices, either handheld devices that can plug into a switch for a Ethernet network, or handheld devices that can be used to do protocol analysis and scanning and vulnerability assessment in a wireless environment. Or you can kind of create your own and hack your own with a laptop running Linux and a wireless PCMCIA card, and you can do it yourself and, roll around the building on a cart. That's one of the ways that wireless penetration testing analysis is done. So I want you to know that protocol analysis and analyzers are a hardware/software solution, and it can be either or both. So protocol analyzers. And I think I've covered the bases on this terminology here. I think we have a good idea of what these tools can do and what they're used for. But I want to talk about OVAL, which is one of the requirements that you know for the Security Plus exam. CompTIA wants you to know about the Open Vulnerability Assessment Software. This is sponsored by the NCSD, which is the National Cybersecurity Division of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. It provides all of its vulnerability content to a couple of other organizations, U.S. CERT being one of them. Now, this open vulnerability assessment language is basically a common language for security experts to use so they can discuss and that they can agree upon technical details about how to look for vulnerabilities on computer systems. There's an OVAL website which displays vulnerability definitions. It does them in XML format, and it does them in SQL format, so it can be stored in the database. It can be stored in a MySQL database, or it can be stored in XML. This is going to provide you a baseline methodology for performing vulnerability assessments on your local computer systems. And it sponsors what's called the CVE. You should know this term. This is the Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures. So lots of government security organizations are going to use these CVE names, these CVE definitions, so they have kind of some common ground and some common vernacular for addressing security attacks and security vulnerabilities. By simply going to this kind of common understanding, it's already in the last few years improved the process by giving us common names for vulnerability exposures so that security assessment tools can be looking for the same things. Now, the ways that they might look for the vulnerabilities might be different, but we do have some commonality here, and that's always a good thing. Now, what are some of these characteristics? Well, OVAL is going to characterize vulnerabilities based on operating systems. It may base it on software applications that are installed, registry settings, or other config files, file system attributes, among other things. So when you go in to do vulnerability assessment or penetration testing, you want to make sure that you or the consultants that come in are going to use OVAL compliant assessment or scanning tools. That way your results, your reports, can be interpreted by a wide variety of different industry standards. OVAL supports Windows, Unix, and Linux. Now, at the heart of risk management and risk mitigation is how we treat that risk. In other words, how do we prevent it, okay? And this is done through controls and countermeasures. Security controls will be the use of technical and non-technical safeguards or methods that are incorporated into computer hardware, software, or firmware. Things like access control mechanisms that we talked about earlier, identification schemes, authentication mechanisms, encryption to keep data and traffic confidential, intrusion detection software. Now, a non-technical control, so let me just jot down right here that we're talking about technical and non-technical. I think we understand what technical is, but non-technical would be things like operational controls, like written security policies, policies and procedures, best practices, operational procedures, personal security, physical and environmental security. Those are non-technical. Now, we can categorize controls in several ways. One way to look at controls is that they're preventative. Okay? A preventative control stops attempts to violate security policy, and it'll have such controls as access control enforcement, encryption, and authentication. So preventative controls really help us out with that CIA, that confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Preventative controls. And you're familiar with those from the access control domain. Detective controls, and I think you know where I'm going with these. Detective controls will warn us of violations or attempted violations of security policy. These can be things like intrusion detection systems, IDS, intrusion prevention systems. It can be alerts, okay? It can be auditing. Auditing is what we call a detective control. And even the checksums that are used at Layer 2 and Layer 3 and Layer 4 of the OSI model. So we've got technical and non-technical, preventative controls and countermeasures, and detective controls and countermeasures. Then we have what are called corrective, okay? This obviously means active after the fact, okay? So this falls under the auspices, and we'll look at this later on in this series, of incident management, or I'll just go with that. Incident management. So corrective means you're going to remediate the vulnerabilities, okay? This could be things like backup procedures, intrusion prevention systems that work with firewalls and routers to block ports and to block IP addresses, and to block processes. The next control is what's called compensatory. Compensatory controls do what they say. They compensate for the increased risks by adding additional control steps to help mitigate the risk. For instance, you might add a challenge response component to weak access controls to compensate for the deficiency. A compensatory countermeasure could be adding another factor to authentication. Where you're dealing with single factor or even two-factor, you may add a third factor. For example, biometrics, fingerprint scanning, hand scanning, facial scanning, compensate for increased risk. Then the last type is what we call deterrent. Deterrents are things that basically are trying to deter malicious users or hackers. These can be posted signs. These can be warning banners that come up when someone tries to log in to a workstation or a router, or someone tries to telnet into our organization. These can be signs that basically say, no piggybacking when you try to use your badge to get access to a building, as I mentioned earlier. Login screens. A deterrent could even be offering a reward for knowledge of a known internal hacker or someone who's misusing security policies. So along with deterrent can be either rewards or the danger of punishment or enforcement when you don't adhere to a security policy. Well, I don't like to go longer than 40 minutes in my nugget, so I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit more here. We'll wrap this up. Assessments and Audits Part 1. We'll talk about a little, again, a revisit and overview of penetration testing and some key things here. And then I'll go ahead and move this monitoring and analysis tools to the first topic we cover in Part 2 of Assessments and Audits. So let's go ahead and look at penetration testing, which will also bring in the concept of gap analysis, which is the basis for our ultimate security action plan. I actually defined penetration testing earlier in this nugget series, but the purpose of penetration testing is to evaluate the security of an organization, the security of a system or an application or a service. This could be an entire network, it could be a server, by simulating an attack by a malicious user or a cracker, or also known as a black hat hacker. This is proactive analysis for any vulnerabilities to known threats. Now, these vulnerabilities can result from just poor configuration of a router or a firewall. It could be flaws in the software code. It could be flaws in the hardware. It could be operational weakness. It could be lack of adherence to security policies, or it could be weakness in technical countermeasures. So you basically carry this out with the mind of a hacker. This goes way beyond just risk assessment and vulnerability assessment. You're literally taking actions to penetrate a system. The goal is to determine the feasibility of an attack and to do what's called a business impact analysis. What is the impact on your business if this particular vulnerability is exploited? Now, it also leads to gap analysis. And gap analysis is necessary for the various components of your security strategy, because you're trying to find those weaknesses, those holes, those gaps in the security mechanisms that are now in place and the level that you should be at to properly seal up and mitigate security threats. Penetration testing and security gap analysis are components of a full-blown security audit process. A couple other terms here. There's what's called black box testing and white box testing. A black box test is basically there's no prior knowledge of the security infrastructure or the environment that you're testing. White box testing basically means that the people that are doing the testing have a pretty much complete knowledge of the infrastructure to be tested. Network diagrams, IP addressing, services, protocols, ports, all that kind of stuff. So basically, you could look at it this way. This is more of a third-party solution. This is more of an insider job, okay? And what you'll see sometimes is kind of a combination of black box and white box by maybe bringing in some objective third parties to help conduct the penetration testing. The test may also be described as full disclosure. In other words, you're kind of working off of a full knowledge or just partial exposure. Maybe you know what the services are, you know what the applications are, you know what the security policy is, but you don't know the specifics of the configuration. Or it could be a total blind test, which is similar to a black box penetration. Finally, the individuals conducting this penetration testing, they could either be using the OSSTMM, which is the open source security testing methodology manual, or they may use some of the standards from the NIST, which is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. NIST is not comprehensive. They'll actually refer to the OSSTMM. There's also a framework known as ISSAF, which is the Information System Security Assessment Framework as well. You don't need to know these acronyms or organizations for your exam, but as a little homework assignment, you might want to go do a Google search on OSSTMM, NIST, and the ISSAF and see how it relates to risk assessment, vulnerability assessment, penetration testing, and security gap analysis. Alright, in Assessments and Audits Part 1, we covered 4 key areas, looked at risk assessment, vulnerability assessment, mitigation, and that means controls and countermeasures, and finally, we kind of did a overview of penetration testing, and also included the concept of gap analysis in there. I hope this CBT nugget has been informative for you. I want to thank you for viewing. We'll see you in Assessments and Audits Part 2.